I published a new post last Thursday, June 25th, 2026, discussing some of my recent trades. A link to my blog post can be found in my profile section here at YouTube. I'm continuing to lightly reduce my stock allocation by eliminating some duplicate positions where I own a stock in more than one of my taxable accounts, or by selling my highest cost shares, which has been occurring regularly, primarily in the equity REIT sector. In my last post, the trades that I discussed resulted in a net reduction in my stock allocation of only $1,814. So this is still minor. My current focus over the past few weeks is to buy investment grade corporate bonds, with a number of those purchases being short term first mortgage bonds issued by operating utilities wholly owned by major U.S. Utility companies like Duke Energy and Energy, ENTERGY, stock symbol is ETR. There are a number of these operating companies that issue first mortgage bonds that are liens on substantially all assets owned by the utility, operating utility. My corporate bond buying has been concentrated recently in 2028 maturities, where I have the right mix, for me at least, of yield and interest rate risk. I have about 50 corporate bonds that I bought prior to today that I have not yet discussed, and they will be discussed and posted over the next 3 weeks. Since I live in a state without a state income tax, the after-tax yield on both U.S. Treasuries and corporate bond interest payments will be the same. States with income taxes will tax corporate bond interest payments, thereby lowering the yield advantage that they have over treasuries, which cannot be taxed by the state when directly owned by the investor. Since I published the last report and blog post, the government published its third estimate of real GDP growth that looks okay on the surface, but when I drill down underneath, it was not so good. The third estimate increased annualized real GDP growth to 2.1% from 1.6% in the second estimate, and that is as far as the good goes. I will be discussing this report in more detail in my next blog post, and will be summarizing some of what I have written here in this video. While AI spending is robust and is now a major driver of GDP growth, and for how long remains an open question, consumer spending still represents 60 to 70% of GDP. The third estimate of personal consumption expenditures during the first quarter of 2026 was revised down to a 0.5% annual rate from the already anemic 1.4% growth rate in the second quarter. And this was the first quarter only had 1 month of the Iraq war causing inflationary problems. A major boost for the real GDP in the first quarter was the 10.6% annualized growth in business fixed investment, up from 2.6% annualized rate in the prior quarter, which was fueled by AI-related spending on data centers and equipment. This is not a long-term driver of the U.S. economy. It may make major contributions for the next 2 years. This spending has benefited also a limited number of companies and their investors, with almost no trickle-down effect to most U.S. consumers and those employed in the labor market. AI will end up being a major negative for job growth. One economist excluded spending on the two categories in the GDP report that are most associated with AI spending, and came up with a 0.3% real GDP growth in the first quarter. 0.3%. I'm referring to Brian Westbury, an economist, and his post on the economy can be found at the First Trust Economics blog. You can find those posts on the economy by Googling that information. To the extent he has any bias or spin to the numbers that he puts on, it is pro-Republican in my opinion. Wild cards for the economy include the current impulsive U.S. president, his tariff and deportation policies that are likely to continue contributing to inflationary pressures, and the Iran war. As I've said in the past, I remain skeptical that anything has actually been resolved in this war, and recently argued in a video that was published here that the IRGC may not be on board with any plan where Iran turns over its highly enriched uranium. A resumption of attacks last Thursday through today highlight the problem. Why would the IRGC attack a container ship on Thursday just because it was attempting to use a path sanctioned by the UN but not by the IRGC, unless the IRGC or some significant faction wants to disrupt the negotiations and close the Strait again, at least until the midterm elections here in the United States. And that faction may not even be controlled in any measure by the political leaders who signed or negotiated the MOU. The enthusiasm of stock investors expressed since the MOU was signed between the U.S. and Iran is based on the reopening of the Strait, and that enthusiasm may soon evaporate due to what is actually happening rather than what investors hoped would happen after Iran and the U.S. signed the MOU. It is a totally unpredictable situation. It could easily become much worse. The general opinion expressed by Iran war supporters, largely those who believe Trump is honest, makes decisions based on a careful analysis of real facts and reliable information, and has good judgment, is that the economic disruptions and hardships that have been caused and may continue to be caused by this war are worth it, since it is presumed as a given that Iran will refrain from developing a nuclear weapon and will turn over all of its enriched uranium. The enrichment process to 60% started, which is still short of weapons grade, started after Trump took the U.S. out of the nuclear agreement negotiated during the Obama administration with Iran, and that was in May of 2018. The enrichment process to 60% started after Trump withdrew the U.S. from that treaty. Iran has not yet, and probably never will, agree to invasive inspections of throughout its territory, which is a necessary prerequisite for having some confidence that it is not developing nuclear weapons and is not enriching uranium to weapons grade levels. And even if it agrees to inspections, maybe for a few years, the main issue to me is that it will have to agree to these kind of inspections almost forever, or at least until there's a radical change in the leadership in Iran so that it becomes a peaceful international law-abiding country, which is not going to happen in my lifetime or probably yours either. The enriched uranium that Iran now has can be stored, and is probably best stored, according to the experts I've read, in small containers the size of a fire extinguisher. And that is to prevent heating to a critical mass level, and It can be safely stored in those kind of small containers. And just think about how dispersed those containers are now throughout the country. And whatever Iran says about turning them over is simply is not going to be believable. So the question is not whether the war is worth its cost by assuming that the war's objectives have been accomplished in any material respect. And that's the assumption that is being made. It is assumed that the war has accomplished its objectives, and therefore it is worth the cost. The problem with the proposed nuclear deal, as I see it, and I've said this in the past, is that it's enhanced by carrots being offered to Iran in the MOU, which, if implemented, includes a $300 billion, quote, redevelopment, end quote, fund, which is more money than the U.S. spent on the Marshall Plan after World War II, adjusted for inflation, and the end of world sanctions against Iran and the return of Iranian assets. Now, if all of those things happen in order to get Iran some kind of agreement with Iran to turn over its enriched uranium and permit inspections for a while, the U.S. would have made Iran a much stronger country and power and probable military power, at least conventional military power, than it had before the war even started.